The forest floor of the Appalachians is a place of endless, slow decay and rebirth. A vast, breathing silence that stretches far beyond the comfortable edges of any map. It is a silence so complete that the human ear, desperate for sound, will sometimes invent things to fill the void. But in the area around White Oak Creek, North Carolina, they say the silence isn't empty, it's waiting. This is where our story begins, in the blistering, hungry humidity of the American summer of 2025, where three young people traded common sense and safety for the promise of a viral video. There was Ethan, the restless, sharp-eyed director, who saw the world only through the lens of a camera, forever hunting for the next big score. He was the force driving them, convinced that the most ancient fears could be monetized, packaged, and sold as entertainment. His face, usually fixed in a perpetual smirk of ambition, was currently obscured by sweat and the brim of a faded hiking hat. Beside him sat Maya, the researcher and the voice of grounded caution. Her specialty was folklore, and every mile marker they passed deepened the worried crease between her brows. She had studied the legends of White Oak Creek, the missing hikers, the abandoned settlements, the consistent local insistence on a sound. A wail that was neither animal nor wind, but something tragically, terribly human. She joined the trip to document genuine folklore, but Ethan's increasingly reckless ambition made her nervous. In the cramped back seat, cradling a custom-built directional microphone like a fragile newborn, was Owen. Owen was their sound engineer, a quiet, intense young man whose true passion lay not in sights but in sound. He wasn't afraid of ghosts. He was afraid of poorly balanced audio levels. He believed the ultimate truth resided in raw wave data, and he dreamed of capturing a sound wave that science had yet to explain. Their mission, as Ethan enthusiastically pitched it on his phone camera, was to spend a week in the most acoustically isolated spot in North America, capturing the truest horror stories, the kind that only the woods know, to produce the ultimate black screen and rain sounds for sleep video. The irony, Maya thought grimly, was that the locals insisted the place killed silence, not provided it. They parked their beat-up SUV off a gravel fire road that had been swallowed by honeysuckle and tall pine. This spot was not a state park. It was merely an absence of pavement, marked only by a rusted metal signpost that had lost its sign decades ago. The air was thick and sweet with pine resin and the heavy, humid promise of a coming thunderstorm. Unloading their gear, Ethan gestured grandly at the dense wall of eastern hardwoods and ancient pines. "Look at it, guys," he whispered, his voice rich with false reverence for the camera. 100-year-old growth, untouched. This isn't some tourist trap with staged spook lights. This is real, raw American legend. He was always careful to sound respectful while planning something utterly disrespectful. Maya sighed, adjusting the heavy pack containing her notebook and geological sensor equipment. "Ethan, we talked about this. The folklore here has specific rules. Locals call this the hush ground. You don't take anything, you don't call out, and you don't disrespect the quiet. It's an old cautionary tale about greed. Cautionary tales are just scripts that haven't been edited yet, Maya," Ethan retorted, flashing a quick, dismissive smile. "Relax. We're scientists of the spooky. We're here to record the data. And the data, my friends, is going to make us rich." He slapped Owen on the shoulder, who merely flinched and checked the wind muff on his microphone. They hiked for 2 difficult miles, cutting straight through the underbrush to reach the location Ethan had pinpointed on an ancient forestry map. A small, natural basin shielded by 2 ridges, acoustically perfect for recording. The deeper they went, the less familiar the sounds became. The robust chorus of cicadas and summer birds, which usually define the Appalachian midday, began to thin out, replaced by a strange, anticipatory quiet. Setting up camp was exhausting work in the oppressive heat. As the sun began to dip, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and orange, Owen meticulously positioned his parabolic microphone array. He was seeking the ambient signature of the woods, the unique mix of insect chirps, leaf rustle, and wind. But when he monitored the input through his sound-dampening headphones, he heard almost nothing. "It's bizarre," Owen finally murmured, pulling the headphones down around his neck. "The natural sound floor is practically non-existent. There should be a cacophony of life, but it's sterile. It's like the forest is holding its breath." Maya shivered, thinking of the local phrase, "The hush ground claims the noise first." As a final, dramatic flourish for the camera, Ethan set up a controlled campfire. The three ate a silent dinner of dehydrated rations, the tension between Maya's unease and Ethan's eagerness stretching thick in the twilight. Ethan, ever the showman, pulled out his handheld recorder. "All right, folks, time for the sound check," he announced to the lens. "I want to get a baseline recording of absolute silence, the purest we can get." He pressed the record button, setting the recorder on a log, then looked toward the deepest, darkest line of trees. For 20 minutes, they sat in complete darkness, the only movement the slow curl of smoke from the fire. The silence was not peaceful. It felt heavy, pressurized, like the whole valley was listening to them. Maya was close to suggesting they pack up and leave. This was not the charming campfire tale quiet of a regular summer night. This was a hostile quiet. Then the silence finally broke. It was not a roar, not a growl, not a crack of thunder. It was a long, thin, wavering sound that started high and piercing, then settled into a deep, sustained tone. It sounded like a woman's voice, full of infinite, ancient pain, dragged across the rough bark of 1,000 dead trees. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence with an awful crystalline precision. Owen jolted upright, tearing his headphones back over his ears, his eyes wide in the dark. "Did you get that?" he whispered, his professional calm shattered. "It's impossible. No human vocal cord could sustain that." Ethan, suddenly pale, fumbled for his camera. The sound faded, leaving behind an echoing void of terror. This was not the campfire ghost story he wanted. This was something that felt genuinely wrong. A sound that burrowed past the ear and settled directly in the chest. They had finally captured what the locals warned them about: the creek siren. Maya hugged her knees, trying to steady her breathing. "We need to go," she insisted, her voice shaking. "That's the whale. It only calls once to see if you're listening. If you answer, you're lost." Ethan, however, was no longer afraid of the sound. He was mesmerized by its power. "No, no, we follow it," he breathed, adrenaline replacing fear. He looked at the recorder, which showed a perfect, terrifying spike on the sound meter. "This is it, guys. This is the true horror we came for." The moral of the night was laid bare in the flickering firelight. The path to success is often paved with caution, but the path to tragedy is paved with reckless curiosity and disrespect for the unseen rules of the land. They had listened to the sound, and now the woods knew their name. As the rain sounds they sought for their video began, not on a black screen, but pattering lightly on the leaves above, a new, gentle curiosity settled over Owen. He played back the audio clip of the whale, and as the mournful sound faded, a tiny, almost subliminal click could be heard right at the end of the track, like a door being carefully unlatched inside the surrounding darkness. The first sound is always the hardest to bear, for it proves you are not alone. But the second stage of the haunting is far more dangerous. It is the realization that the silence afterward is not an ending, but a strategy. The morning after the whale found them, the small campsite by the Appalachian ridges felt less like a base of operations and more like a crime scene. A tense, thick silence had settled over the three young people, unbroken by the usual sounds of summer dawn. No chirping birds, no rustle of squirrel through the pine needles. The forest seemed to be holding its breath again, waiting for a response to the spectral call. Maya packed her things with clipped, furious movements, the soft thump of her gear hitting the ground echoing too loudly. "We leave," she stated, her voice low and tight as she confronted Ethan. "We got the sound. We know it's real. It's exactly what the legends described, and every legend says the next thing you do is turn back." Ethan, nursing a mug of instant coffee, was running the audio clip of the previous night's wail on a continuous loop, listening through a single earbud. His eyes were bright, glazed over with a manic intensity that Maya hadn't seen before. The fear that had briefly touched him was entirely gone, replaced by the white-hot hunger of the obsessed. "Listen to the decay on this," Ethan murmured, holding out the device but not waiting for her reply. "It's impossible. It has to be something tonal, something mechanical. And the reverb signature, it's like the whole valley is the instrument. We can't leave, Maya. Not now. This is the origin story of the sound. We have to follow it to the source." Owen, who had slept poorly, watching the audio levels on his receiver dip and spike inexplicably, spoke up, his voice raspy. "He's right about the signature. But Maya's right about the feeling. That wasn't a sound effect. It felt like a question. And I think the woods are waiting for our answer." Owen pointed a shaky finger toward the north ridge, a direction where the trees grew thicker, darker, and seemed to lean inward, creating an eternal shadow. It came from there. Against Maya's fervent protests, Ethan won the argument by appealing to their shared ambition and fear of regret. He was the one funding the trip, the one with the final edit. They would follow the bearing of the sound for 2 more miles, capture the ultimate high-definition recording, and then they would leave. Maya relented, but she took the lead, choosing a path that was visibly harder but kept them moving in a straight line, away from the temptation of pre-existing trails. The deeper they moved off-trail, the more oppressive the heat became, yet it felt wrong. Not the natural, sun-baked heat of a summer day, but a stale, breathless warmth, like being trapped in an attic. The forest here showed signs of life, but everything was slightly off. Leaves were disproportionately large, moss grew in pale, sickly yellow patches, and the only insects were small, silent black flies that didn't bite, but merely tracked them with disturbing persistence. They finally reached the top of the second ridge, and the view that opened before them was startling. The canopy below was unnaturally dense, and through a narrow break, Maya spotted what looked like a dried-up riverbed running through the valley floor. "That's White Oak Creek," Maya said, checking her map against her compass. "It shouldn't be dry. This region had heavy rainfall 2 weeks ago. Creeks here run deep all summer. Maybe it diverted," Ethan suggested, already filming. "Perfect. We can walk straight down the bed. That'll take us right to the source of the sound, and it's cinematic as hell." The descent was treacherous, forcing them to clamber over rocks slick with a strange, oily residue that smelled faintly of copper and decaying earth. When they finally reached the creek bed, the unnatural atmosphere intensified. There was a thin layer of damp, gray silt, but not a single trickle or pool of water. The rocks were smooth and bone-dry, and the absence of the normal sounds of moving water, the trickling, the bubbling, the natural flow, was deafening. Owen, constantly wearing his headphones now, stopped dead in the middle of the empty bed. He lifted his hand, signaling the others to stop. "What is it, Owen?" Ethan whispered, camera trained on his sound man. "The sound floor. It's gone." Owen breathed, his voice hollow. "Not just quiet. It's like the air itself is sucking the sound out. Every leaf rustle, every footstep. It's disappearing right after it's made. This isn't acoustical isolation, it's active suppression. He checked his main recorder, a high-end digital field recorder known for its reliability. The device was blinking erratically, displaying an alarming error message. Input overflow, signal type unknown. Maya crouched down, examining a large, flat slab of rock near the center of the bed. It was covered in a thick layer of green moss, but sticking out from the top was a small, crudely fashioned iron spike. A surveyor's marker, half swallowed by the earth. She reached out and touched it. A jolt of cold, deep and instantaneous, shot up her arm, despite the summer heat. The metal hummed faintly beneath the moss, resonating with a frequency too low to hear, but which she felt deep in her teeth. "This is an ancient marker," Maya said, rubbing the circulation back into her fingers. "But it's not for boundaries. Feels like a ward, like something was pinned down here." She consulted her notes on Appalachian lore, remembering a story about a silent heart, a spot where a great wrong was committed, and the earth drank the living water to silence the cries of the victim. The ground was consecrated by its curse, and it was meant to be avoided entirely. Ethan stepped closer, filming the marker. "A ward? Or a clue? Look how perfect the moss is, how undisturbed. This is the spot, guys. This is the heart of the hush ground." His voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes fixed on the camera. "We're standing where the water gave up, where the life stopped flowing. And now we're going to find out why." Owen pulled off his headphones, his face pale and distressed. "My equipment is done. It's not recording silence, Ethan. It's recording noise. A low frequency, non-human, constant static that sounds like, I don't know, like the planet is grinding its teeth." He shoved the recorder into his bag. "We are disrespecting this place. This ground is hurt, Maya is right. We should leave it be." But Ethan merely turned his attention to the camera, a triumphant gleam in his eye, ignoring the pleas of his two friends and the distress of their high-tech gear. He had what he wanted, proof of a legitimate, unknown phenomenon, confirmed by the failure of science itself. He had crossed the natural boundary of the flowing creek, and there would be no easy way back. The moral was now undeniably clear. Respect natural boundaries and heed the signs of the land's distress. For sometimes, a place is silent not because it is peaceful, but because it is grievously wounded and cannot be disturbed. As the sun began its high arc, casting strange, elongated shadows across the dry creek bed, they noticed something unnatural just beyond a cluster of pale, twisted birch trees. A small, unnatural clearing. It was far too neat for a natural part of the woods. Curiosity, always the deadliest impulse, drew them forward, despite the cold terror tightening in their chests. What sight could possibly merit such a calculated absence of sound? In the deep wilderness, natural chaos is the law. Branches fall where they will. Debris settles where the wind guides it. When you encounter a place of unnatural order, a pattern that demands recognition, you are no longer in the woods. You are in a chamber and you have stumbled upon a ritual. The small clearing, tucked behind the sickly pale birch trees, was not carved out by nature. It was an intentional space, a perfect circle of undisturbed, dark earth, defined by an unsettling, almost clinical tidiness. Here, the oppression of the hush ground was absolute. The silence was so profound it felt like a pressure against the eardrums. The air was colder here, too, a pocket of chill despite the midday sun attempting to penetrate the canopy. As they stepped into the circle, Maya stopped, her breath catching. Her earlier fear of the whale was replaced by a deeper, more primal dread of what they were witnessing. This was not a natural phenomenon. This was intelligence, patience, and some kind of strange, dark artistry. The clearing's centerpiece was a large arrangement of deer skulls. Dozens of them, bleached white by time and weather, were laid out meticulously. They were all perfect, clean specimens, not a sign of predation or scavenging on any of them. They were not scattered randomly but placed deliberately, forming a cryptic, spiraling pattern that seemed to draw the eye toward the center of the clearing. Ethan immediately started filming, his professionalism overcoming his fear. "Unbelievable," he whispered, less in awe and more in anticipation of the clicks he would receive. "This is staged. Some local hermit probably trying to keep people out. It's effective set dressing. I'll give them that." He tried to touch one of the larger skulls, but Maya slapped his arm away. "Don't," she hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the unbroken line of trees surrounding the circle. "This isn't set dressing, Ethan. This is an offering or a boundary marker. In old folklore, particularly regarding cryptids or certain territorial spirits, skulls and bone arrangements act as warnings, or sometimes as a form of payment to the land to keep the silence. You don't interfere with the geometry of a shrine." Owen, strangely quiet, wasn't looking at the pattern. He was walking slowly along the perimeter, his sound meter now stubbornly refusing to display any metrics, the screen blank white. He stopped at the edge of the circle and knelt beside one of the smaller, older skulls, one placed at the very end of the spiral's tail. "Look," Owen called out, his voice barely audible above the heavy silence. He didn't sound excited or scared, just profoundly disturbed. Inside the hollow cavity of the skull, nestled perfectly in the socket where the brain once resided, was a small object. It was a roughly carved wooden figure, no larger than a thumb. It wasn't smoothed or polished. It was primitive, made from a dark, unfamiliar wood, depicting a slender, elongated figure with 3 horizontal lines crudely etched across its center, giving it the appearance of being wrapped or tied. Maya recognized the style instantly. She had seen drawings of similar objects in her deep woods research, totems often used by reclusive Appalachian communities. "That's a protective fetish," she explained, her voice softening with sudden, almost fearful respect. "It's meant to contain or deflect. It was placed there to make the payment complete. It's what keeps the whale from coming closer." "A charm," Ethan scoffed, moving closer with his camera focused tightly on the tiny figure. "It's the money shot, people. This is the proof. We tell the story of the siren, and then we reveal the artifact she leaves behind. We need to document it, hold it, make it real." Before Maya could physically stop him, Ethan reached 2 fingers into the skull's eye socket, pinched the small wooden doll, and pulled it free. The moment the doll left its resting place, the atmosphere of the clearing shifted violently. It wasn't a loud noise, but a sudden, sharp intake of breath by the surrounding trees. The cold pocket of air vanished, replaced by a momentary, searing heat that prickled their skin. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate. A pulse felt deep in the soles of their boots. Owen dropped backward onto the damp earth, clutching his sound equipment bag. "Did you feel that?" he stammered, his eyes wide with a genuine, unadulterated terror. The silence just snapped. Something just broke. Ethan, holding the dark wooden doll lightly in his palm, was already dismissing the feeling. "It was the humidity changing, guys. We're on high alert. You're overthinking it." He carefully placed the doll in a small, sealed evidence bag, labeling it with his initials, treating the sacred relic like a geological sample. His ambition had blinded him to the reality of his action. He had committed an act of blatant disrespect and theft in a place that demanded absolute honor. Maya stared at the spot where the doll had rested. The empty deer skull now looked hollow, vulnerable, and angry. The spiral pattern of bones, moments ago a static display, now seemed to twist and coil with newfound energy, centered on the empty space. She realized the terrible moral choice Ethan had just made. He had taken a gift or a ward, believing it was merely a prop. She spoke softly, but the weight of her words felt heavier than the ambient silence. Ethan, you didn't just take a souvenir. That doll was paying the toll for the quiet. You broke the deal. This is more than just curiosity. This is greed, and the woods will see it as a declaration. As they reluctantly turned and headed back toward the creek bed, the surrounding trees felt closer, thicker, and far more numerous. They had a chilling sense of being watched, not by a curious animal, but by an ancient, patient presence. The gentle curiosity that usually drives discovery was gone, replaced by the certainty of a dangerous, imminent consequence. The woods had been disrespected, and the siren now had a clear path and a target. What would the legendary, mournful voice say now that it was no longer kept at bay? And more terrifyingly, what name would it call when it finally returned? When a spirit is merely angry, it screams at the air. When a spirit is hunting, it calls out a name. But when it finds a piece of you, a piece of your history, a kernel of your deepest affection, it changes its song entirely. It stops being a legend, and it becomes a lullaby. The main camp, which had once felt like their safe, modern bubble, was now a patch of exposed ground surrounded by a dense, judgmental darkness. The three friends went through the motions of camp life, but the energy between them was brittle, shattered by the afternoon's reckless act of theft. Ethan sat hunched over his laptop, the tiny wooden doll, the stolen ward, sealed away in a pelican case beside him, guarded like a chest of gold. He reviewed the footage of the skull spiral, his face illuminated by the cold glow of the screen. He was desperate to find a rational explanation for the tremor in the earth, the sudden rush of heat. He tried to ignore the fact that Maya and Owen refused to even sit near him. Maya, meanwhile, was meticulously cataloging her still images, focusing on the peripheral areas of the skull clearing. Every third or fourth photo, she noticed, contained a faint, brown-gray smear in the deep shadows, a blur that was too tall and too structured to be a branch or a shadow play. It was human-shaped, elongated, and seemed to be tracking their movements from behind the trees. She felt a profound moral revulsion toward Ethan. His greed had painted a target on them all. Owen was the worst affected by the emotional and sonic atmosphere. He lay rigid in his tent, wrapped in his sleeping bag despite the humidity, his sophisticated microphones uselessly silent in the darkness. His fear was professional. The woods had defied the laws of physics, and now they were coming for him. As the moon climbed high and pale over the silent ridge, the forest answered their weight. It began not with the sudden shock of the previous night's scream, but with a gradual, insidious pressure, a slow tightening of the air around the camp. It was a silence so dense that when the first sound came, it felt close enough to touch. This time, the wail was not mournful or distant. It was sharp, direct, and possessive. It sounded like it was coming from the valley floor below them, yet somehow also right next to Ethan's tent flap. It was pure, high-frequency sound, a crystalline shriek of agony that seemed to be actively trying to break something inside their heads. Maya clamped her hands over her ears, tears stinging her eyes from the pressure. Owen, driven by his sound engineer's instinct to document the impossible, scrambled out of his tent and ran toward the parabolic mic array. He hit record, sacrificing a moment of sanity for the sake of the data, capturing the horrifying peak of the sound. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds before it faded back into the heavy, suffocating silence. Shaking, Owen quickly dragged the laptop near the fire pit and transferred the fresh audio clip. Ethan and Maya watched him, their faces drawn and pale in the firelight. "It's louder," Maya whispered, pulling her hands away from her ringing ears. It knows we're here. It's closing the distance. Wait, Owen said, his fingers flying over the playback controls. I need to analyze the tonal signature. Last night it was pure, unmodulated frequency. This one, it felt different, almost patterned. He isolated the section and played it back through the laptop's tiny speakers. The horrifying wail tore through the air again, making them all recoil. But as the sustained pitch began to drop, something truly monstrous occurred. The shriek did not decay into silence. Instead, it smoothed, modulated, and transformed into a soft, melodic lullaby. It was a simple, old-fashioned tune, the kind a mother sings to a child. And as the melody unfolded, a soft, raspy whisper layered itself over the music, distinct and chillingly familiar, like sand on silk. The whisper articulated a name. Little Lark. Ethan froze. His body went slack, and the blood drained from his face, leaving him chalk white. He wasn't looking at the camera, or the sound guy, or the terrifying woods. He was looking 1,000 miles away, into a memory that was his alone. Little Lark. It was a nickname his mother, who had died when he was a child, had used exclusively. He had never shared it with Maya or Owen. It was a deeply buried secret, a painful, sentimental kernel of his private history. Play it again, Ethan croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Gone was the ambitious director. Standing there was a terrified, exposed boy. Owen, equally stunned, replayed the loop, the shriek, the melody, and then the haunting, soft whisper. Little Lark, are you lost? Your bed is waiting. That's not folklore, Ethan, Maya said, her voice trembling but steady. That's information. Tailored the hunt. It knows you, it knows your vulnerability, and it's using it to draw you in. She pointed her finger at the closed pelican case containing the doll. You took something personal from its ground, and now it's taking something personal from yours. As Maya spoke, she quickly pulled up the blurred images she had captured earlier. She zoomed in on one of the figures, a tall, shadowy form just beyond the tree line. In the next frame, the blurred figure was closer, almost at the edge of the camp perimeter. It was watching them, and it was unblinking. It's not just the voice, Maya said, her eyes fixed on the screen. We have company. The creek siren is here, and it's calling you, Ethan. Ethan finally understood the sheer magnitude of his disrespect. He hadn't just stolen a prop. He had announced his presence, his name, and his weakness to an ancient predator. The chase wasn't about the footage anymore. It was deeply personal, an emotional hook that surpassed any physical threat. The woods had demanded payment, and they were collecting it by calling him home to a place that only pretended to offer comfort. The moral of this escalating dread was a harsh one. When you seek to exploit the hidden fears of the world for profit, you expose your own deepest weaknesses, and the darkness will use your private history as the perfect, irresistible lure. Now exposed and utterly terrified, Ethan fumbled for his map. The siren's lullaby seemed to be guiding him, not toward random madness, but toward a specific, tangible location hinted at in the lullaby's fading resonance. A place that felt like shelter, safety, and perhaps a final resting place. The map showed a faint, broken line leading away from the creek bed, straight to a spot marked simply, Old Smith Homestead, 1910. When the forest wants you to be lost, it hides the paths. But when the haunting is personal, it lays out a clear, inviting path to a place that promises shelter. It offers the terrible, sweet relief of false comfort. It gives you a destination, knowing that a desperate hope is a far more powerful lure than any scream. The morning brought no relief, only a desperate, silent retreat. Ethan was now operating on pure, nervous adrenaline. His eyes twitching between the map line marking the old Smith homestead and the pelican case containing the stolen wooden doll. He no longer cared about framing the shot. He simply wanted to reach the destination that the lullaby seemed to be pointing toward. He saw the cabin as the next vital clue, a confirmation of the siren's origin. Maya and Owen, however, saw it as the trapdoor. They broke camp quickly, leaving most of the high-tech, malfunctioning sound gear behind, only carrying the cameras, essentials, and the laptop containing the corrupted audio file. The walk was agonizingly difficult. They were following a nearly erased fire road, forcing them to push through thorny thickets and scramble over rockslides. The woods remained locked in that unnatural, heavy silence, the air still and stale, watching them move. The silence was the worst part. It made every footstep sound like a thunderclap, every ragged breath like a shout. Maya kept glancing back, certain that the blurred, tall shapes she had seen in her photos were now following, soundlessly matching their pace just beyond the visibility line. Late in the afternoon, just as exhaustion and mounting terror threatened to turn them against one another, they found it. Tucked into a fold in the ridge, shrouded by weeping willow and dense, ancient hemlock, stood the Smith homestead. It was a single, squat cabin built of rough-hewn pine logs, tilting dangerously to one side, its windows dark and empty, two black eyes staring blankly at the indifferent forest. It was the most human structure they had seen since they entered the hushed ground, and yet it was terrifying in its decay. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb that had been carelessly propped open. "It's here," Ethan breathed, filming the cabin's sagging, moss-covered porch. "Smith homestead. This has to be connected to the whale. They must have been the first victims." Maya approached the cabin with extreme caution. The porch floor felt spongy beneath her feet, and the heavy oak door had swung inward on a single rusty hinge, revealing a darkness inside that the afternoon sun seemed to recoil from. The air inside was cool, carrying the sharp, metallic smell of rust, mold, and something indefinably sweet and sickening. Inside, the cabin was a disaster of collapse, but there were relics. A rusty stove lay overturned, its pipe long since vanished. In a corner, sheltered from the worst of the rain by the pitch of the roof, was a small, crudely built wooden desk. And on that desk, surprisingly intact, lay a heavily water-damaged journal. Ethan snatched the journal up, his hands shaking, recognizing the value of the physical evidence. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in faded ink and pressed local flower petals. The handwriting was neat, dated around 1912, detailing the optimistic start of a small, isolated settlement. They huddled together, reading the brittle, fading entries by the light filtering through the broken windows. The initial entries were about clearing land, hard work, and the abundance of game. Then the tone gradually shifted. August 14th, 1912. "The silence here is unnatural. The children complain the night sounds have stopped. Thomas says the woods are holding their tongue. September 5th, 1912. We heard the singing woman tonight. It was far away, a sound of incredible sorrow. It hurt to listen to it, but it made me want to go to her. Thomas forbade anyone to leave the homestead. October 1st, 1912. The wailing is closer now. It knows my name, though I never spoke it to the trees. It calls me my lost little. It sounds like my mother. We barricaded the windows. The men are arguing." October 10th, 1912. The wailing stopped. Just stopped. The woods have gone deaf. It is a heavier sound than the scream was. The silence is the worst part. It means she is near. Never trust the silence. The final entry was just a smear of ink, a frantic scrawl that read, "I hear nothing, but I know she is standing right by the writing abruptly vanished, cut off mid-sentence, leaving the rest of the page terrifyingly blank. Maya slammed the journal shut. Her hands were wet with perspiration. That's it, Ethan. That's your proof. The singing woman is the creek siren. She targeted them personally, just like she targeted you with Little Lark. And the silence, the hushed ground, it's not a barrier. It's the predator's hunting shroud. Owen, who had been listening with morbid dread, nodded fiercely. The silence is what precedes the final disappearance. It's the moment they're trapped. A logical person armed with the documented tragedy of the past would flee immediately. But Ethan, staring at the journal in his hands, saw only the final chapter of his story. They were scared and unprepared. We're modern. We have equipment. We know the rules now. We know the siren hunts when the sound stops. He looked around the crumbling, dust-filled cabin, seeing a narrative set piece where his friends saw a death trap. "We stay here tonight," he declared, his voice resolute but tinged with panic. "The journal confirms this is the place of the confrontation. We film the final act right here. The siren will come. We'll be ready. We're not making the same mistake they did." Before Maya could launch her furious objection, the decision was violently taken out of their hands. A sudden, drastic change occurred outside the cabin. The soft sunlight filtering through the grime was abruptly extinguished, replaced by a dense, suffocating gray. A thick, unsettlingly white fog rolled into the clearing, enveloping the cabin in a cottony shroud that seemed to absorb all remaining color and light. They rushed to the window, seeing nothing but the swirling, milky mist pressing against the glass. The air temperature plummeted instantly, and the fog was cold, heavy, and silent. They were now completely isolated, the world reduced to the confines of the tilting homestead. The forest had closed in, and they were caught exactly where the unfortunate settlers had been over a century ago. The moral was delivered with crushing finality. Ignoring the history of the land and repeated warnings, even when they are physically documented, is not bravery. It is an unforgivable foolishness that leads straight to the same tragic end. Ethan, Maya, and Owen stood trapped in the cabin of empty promises, the stolen wooden doll trembling slightly inside its case, and the white mist outside already starting to feel less like natural fog and more like the veil of a waiting, silent presence. When the forest is ready to claim you, it doesn't need physical chains. It uses disorientation. The white mist, the locals called it, a fog so dense it swallows not just light and sound, but direction. It turns the earth into a churning puzzle, convincing you that the only way forward is deeper into the dark heart of the hushed ground. The sudden descent of the white fog was not a weather event. It was a cage snapping shut. The mist pressed against the cabin's rotting walls, thick and colorless, reducing visibility to mere feet. It smelled of ozone and cold stone, utterly devoid of the rich, earthy scent of the Appalachian forest. Panic, raw and immediate, flared in Ethan. "We need to get out of this," he choked out, fumbling with his phone and portable GPS unit. "If we can just get a clear satellite lock, we can backtrack to the fire road." Maya and Owen watched as Ethan's face fell. The GPS screen remained stubbornly blank, displaying the same infuriating message, searching for signal. The cabin, deep in the isolated valley, was already a challenge for reception, but this was absolute failure. The air itself seemed to block the connection. "Forget the phone," Maya commanded, pulling out a standard, liquid-filled magnetic compass from her kit. She set it carefully on the rough-hewn table, waiting for the needle to settle. Didn't. Instead of pointing north, the compass needle began to spin wildly, accelerating in erratic, jerky circles before finally vibrating itself into a completely random, useless standstill. Owen peered at the device, horrified. "It's localized magnetic interference," he whispered, his technical mind struggling to explain the supernatural. Or the ground itself is shifting the polarity. We're in a pocket. The tech can't see the real world anymore. They were truly lost. Not just geographically, but dimensionally. The cabin was now their only reality, surrounded by a swirling, white void. Ethan's ambition was replaced by sheer terror. He was trapped exactly where the journal warned him they would be. As the light outside faded completely, plunging the cabin into a deep twilight, Maya ran her hand along the interior log walls, trying to gauge the structural integrity. Her fingers caught on something rougher than the splintered wood. She stopped, leaning closer, and pulled out her flashlight. Etched into the dark pine, low to the floor, was a pattern. It was a rhythmic series of deep, deliberate scratches, made with something sharp and unyielding. They were not random lines, but 3 perfectly horizontal scrapes, repeated over and over, following the grain of the wood. Owen joined her, holding his light steady. He traced the pattern with a finger, then his eyes snapped to the pelican case where the stolen artifact rested. The doll, Owen breathed. The ward, the etchings. They matched the 3 lines carved across the wooden figure. Ethan, who was pacing frantically, stopped. He saw the link immediately. The victims who were trapped here over a century ago, the Smith family, had left this horrifying evidence. The scratches were a mark, either a protective symbol they were carving, or something that was done to them as they tried to escape. If the doll was a ward against the siren, its specific pattern was known to the family and to the entity itself. They were trying to warn us, Maya murmured, a cold certainty settling over her. They were trying to document what they saw on the thing that attacked them, or what they used to keep it out. We broke their last defense when we stole it. Just as the truth of their predicament became agonizingly clear, Owen noticed a disturbing change in Maya. She had frozen near the window, her gaze fixed on the dense, unmoving blanket of white mist outside. Her expression was strangely peaceful, a vacant, almost ecstatic look washing over her features. She wasn't blinking. "Maya?" Owen asked, his voice cracking. She didn't respond. He stepped closer, seeing her lips part slightly, as if listening to a distant, beautiful sound that only she could perceive. The hypnotic effect of the siren was back, but this time it was silent, tailored to her own exhaustion and despair. She's listening to the lullaby again, Ethan realized, recognizing the same, faraway look that had glazed his own eyes the night before. The siren is pulling her out. Acting on a primal instinct, Owen lunged forward and roughly slapped the sound-dampening headphones he had been wearing earlier onto Maya's head, covering her ears. He turned the volume to the absolute maximum, pumping white noise, a chaotic, unpatterned hiss, into the sound cups. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Maya let out a small shriek and stumbled back, tearing the headphones off. Her eyes snapped back into focus, wild with sudden, genuine terror. "It was singing to me," she gasped, clutching her temples. "It was so soft, saying everything was quiet, everything was restful, telling me to step outside, that my family was waiting in the fog." They had saved Maya from the lure, but the terrifying implication remained. The siren could compromise their minds silently, using the veil of the white mist. Their over-reliance on technology had failed them, blinding them to the magnetic and sonic chaos. It took Owen's forgotten, low-tech sound-dampening gear to break the spell. The terrible moral lesson of the night was thus delivered. Never trust the tools you rely on more than your own intuition. When technology fails, it's often because a deeper, more primal power is at work, and your only defense lies in recognizing the unnatural silence and trusting your gut fear. As the 3 friends huddled together in the collapsing, scratching-marked cabin, The silence outside became even heavier. The wail was gone, the lullaby was silenced, and the fog remained thick. The siren wasn't singing anymore. It was close enough now that it didn't need a song. It had reached the next phase of the hunt, and the time for screaming was over. A true predator does not announce its presence with noise. It uses the quiet. The screams are meant to lure you, and the lullabies are meant to tempt you. But when the silence arrives, heavy and complete, it means the siren is no longer interested in calling. It means the hunting shroud is drawn close, and the hunter is now close enough to see. The final, total silence that descended upon the cabin was more suffocating than any scream. It was not the natural quiet of a sleeping forest. It was a vacuum, a sonic hole where all ambient sound was actively murdered. The air felt cold and dead, and even the simple sounds of the cabin, the creak of a floorboard, the whisper of dry rot, had been suppressed. They were living inside the chilling final warning of the settler's journal. Never trust the silence. Ethan, Maya, and Owen huddled together near the overturned stove, their flashlights casting frantic, overlapping beams that did little to pierce the darkness or the terrifying reality. They could hear nothing but the frantic thumping of their own hearts, amplified to an unbearable drumbeat in the soundless room. "It stopped," Owen whispered, his voice thin and raw. He had the sound-dampening headphones pressed tightly over his ears, yet he claimed he could still feel the pressure of the quiet. "It's completely gone. No wail, no lullaby, no static. Nothing." "That means it's here," Maya replied, fear sharpening her voice into a knife's edge. The Smith Journal said the silence meant she was near. The silence is the space she creates to trap you. She remembered the blurred shapes in her photos, the shadows that followed without sound. They were no longer shadows. Then, through the grime and condensation coating the only intact window pane, they saw them. The white mist outside was thick, but it was not uniform. Large, human-shaped distortions were moving within the swirling gray. They were tall and slender, darker than the surrounding fog, but lacking the sharp edges of normal shadow. They moved with a disturbing, fluid stillness, gliding rather than walking, occasionally bending or tilting in ways that defied human anatomy. They looked like silhouettes carved from pure, soundless dread. "Look," Ethan rasped, raising his camera instinctively. The impulse to capture the footage, even in the face of absolute terror, was still deeply ingrained. "They're out there. We have to get this, we have to show the world the—" As he powered up his camera, aiming its weak lens toward the largest, closest distortion, the device let out a brief, pathetic whine. The battery indicator, which moments before had shown a healthy 80% charge, instantly dropped to 0. The screen went black. Simultaneously, Owen's remaining handheld recorder and Maya's geological sensor, which she was using to detect vibration, died completely. "It's draining the power," Owen whispered, eyes wide with horror. "It's soaking up the energy. It's a field. It's a curse, an electrical vacuum." The silence, they realized, was not passive. It was the effect of an active suppression field, a supernatural force that was consuming all forms of life and energy, sound, light, and battery power, to finalize the trap. Just as the realization solidified, the entire cabin shuddered. The low, guttural vibration was not audible, but they felt it through the floorboards. A heavy, scraping sound that was moving slowly around the perimeter. The unblinking distortions outside were closing in, surrounding the small, brittle box of wood and fear. Ethan backed away, stumbling over a rotten floor beam. He bumped against the table where he had placed the Pelican case. The case wasn't rattling from the force of his impact. It was vibrating from within. Maya rushed forward and ripped open the latch. Inside the foam lining, The tiny, stolen wooden doll was trembling violently. It was humming with a low, tight frequency that they could feel in their bones, its surface slick with a strange, cold moisture. It was fighting, struggling against the entity outside, confirming its original purpose as a ward. Ethan's greed had not just removed the defense. It had captured the defense mechanism and was now forcing it to struggle against its true purpose. The trembling of the doll only grew more frantic, until it felt like a trapped bird beating its wings against the wood. Suddenly, one of the distortions outside the window stopped. It glided right up to the glass, its shape resolving slightly, not into a definite creature, but into a horrifying semblance of a tall, thin figure wearing a dark, heavy coat. Its head was indistinct, but where the eyes should have been, there were two spots of absolute, unmoving darkness that seemed to peer directly into their souls. It was the unblinking watcher, the silent sentinel of the siren, studying its trapped prey. It raised a long, impossibly slender arm and placed a hand against the pane of glass, leaving a slick, dark residue. The final, terrible, soundless message was clear. They were seen, they were trapped, and the time for running was over. The silence was the end. The harsh moral lesson was undeniable. True terror doesn't need theatrics or loud warnings. It is the unnerving absence of life, the methodical stillness of a silent predator, and the realization that the entity has already drained everything you need to fight or flee. They had sought the sound of horror, and instead, they found the ultimate silence. The figure pressed harder against the glass, and the doll in the case gave a final, desperate tremor, as if bracing itself for a physical breach. The cabin, their last shelter, was about to be violated, and their only remaining defense was a powerless, furious act of recklessness waiting to happen. Fear has two reactions: paralysis or a violent surge of desperate, irrational action. When the silent hunter is at the door, and the only defense is a trinket stolen out of greed, the victim often makes the final, most terrible mistake, believing that by destroying the mistake, they can erase the consequence. The cabin was a tomb now, surrounded by the soundless, pressing weight of the white mist and the looming figure of the unblinking watcher outside the window. The small, stolen wooden doll inside the pelican case was vibrating so violently it sounded like a frantic wasp trying to escape. Its desperate struggle confirmed Maya's chilling hypothesis. It wasn't a curse. It was a ward, and they had deactivated its protective spell the moment Ethan took it from its bed of bones. A slow, sickening realization dawned on Ethan, eclipsing the last shreds of his ambition. His greed had not only led them into the trap but had systematically dismantled every barrier between them and the siren. He had broken the deal the land had struck with the ancient entities. He looked at the doll, then at the terror etched on Maya's and Owen's faces. He had to act, to regain some control over the fate he had carelessly set in motion. The doll? Ethan rasped, his eyes wide and feverish. It's the anchor. It's what connects us to the siren's ground. It's what she wants back. If we destroy it, the connection breaks. She can't follow what doesn't exist. Maya's jaw dropped. No, Ethan, don't be an idiot. It's a ward. It's fighting. We should put it back. It might buy us time. Where? Outside, in the fog. Ethan shouted, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the dead silence. He grabbed the pelican case, his movements jerky with panicked determination. It's too late for that. We're trapped. If it's the anchor, we cut the rope. Ignoring Maya's furious shout of protest, Ethan wrestled the case open, snatching the small, dark wooden figure. It was shockingly cold and wet in his palm, slick with the strange moisture that had accumulated during its frantic vibrating. The figure felt strangely pliable, almost like soft bone, despite being carved wood. He raised his heavy hiking boot, intending to smash the doll against the stone of the overturned stove. "Ethan, no!" Maya screamed, lunging for his arm, but she was too slow. Ethan brought his boot down with all his terrified strength. There was no crack of wood shattering. Instead, a thin, sharp, and intensely high-pitched shriek ripped through the soundless cabin. The sound was internal, originating not from the doll itself, but seemingly from the very air between Ethan's foot and the ground, like a sonic glass shard. The force of the sound, though brief, was physical. Ethan was thrown violently sideways, slamming hard against the log wall near the door. The tiny doll, miraculously intact, spun away and skittered across the floor, coming to rest precisely on one of the settler's frantic, carved scratch marks. Ethan lay crumpled, gasping. He tried to push himself up, but a fresh wave of pain shot through his left leg. He had impacted the wall at an awkward angle, and the agonizing throb told them his leg was badly injured, likely fractured. The consequences were immediate and terrifyingly direct. Ethan's foolish, reckless act of destruction had not only failed to break the connection, but it had triggered an immediate, defensive retribution from the entity. He was now wounded, immobile, and completely dependent on the very friends he had imperiled. Outside the window, the unblinking watcher reacted. The tall, dark distortion lifted its hand from the glass, but now its movements were no longer fluid or gliding, seemed to grow solid, massive, and angry. It stepped back slightly, then swung its arm forward in a quick, brutal motion, striking the corner of the cabin with a soundless, heavy impact. The cabin groaned, tilting further, and a torrent of dry leaves and rotten wood dust rained down from the ceiling. A plank near the front door splintered. The siren was no longer content to wait. It was actively trying to force its way in, drawn by the burst of energy from the failed attack on its tether. Owen, seeing his friend injured and the predator escalating, reacted with a desperate surge of loyalty and technical obsession. He ignored Ethan and scrambled toward the doll, placing his foot over it to protect it, even as the walls around them began to creak ominously. "He broke the last line," Maya cried, rushing to Ethan's side and gently examining his throbbing leg. It wasn't a cursed doll. It was a vibrating alarm for the siren. Now she knows exactly where we are, and she's furious. The air in the room was electric with the siren's rage. Ethan's recklessness had turned the subtle, psychological game into a desperate, physical fight for survival. His obsession with capturing the true horror had led him to physically wound himself and invite the very entity they feared. The moral was delivered with a heavy price. Uncontrolled recklessness and the refusal to acknowledge the true nature of the sacred are not acts of courage. They are acts of self-sabotage that compromise not only yourself but everyone who depends on you. As the unblinking watcher prepared to strike the cabin again, Owen looked frantically at his dead sound equipment, knowing that the only thing that had ever repelled the siren was an overwhelming burst of sound, the chaotic white noise that had broken Maya's trance. They were out of power, out of options, and the physical breach was seconds away. When everything is broken, the body, the mind, and the technology, you are left with only the most basic, desperate weapons. The siren hunts by creating silence and then filling it with a personalized lure. To survive, you must fight fire with fire, and silence with the most chaotic, overwhelming noise you have left. The cabin was seconds from collapse. Ethan lay injured, his ambition finally crushed by the agonizing pain in his leg and the soundless fury of the unblinking watcher outside. The figure struck the log wall again, a sickening, heavy thud that rattled their teeth and cracked the rotting timbers near the door. Maya, seeing Ethan immobile and the walls failing, knew they were out of time. She briefly checked the pulse in his neck. "Owen," she gasped, her voice thick with fear and adrenaline. "We have to move. Get Ethan." No, wait. Owen cut her off, his eyes fixed on the array of useless, battery-drained sound equipment piled in the corner. His hands, driven by a sound engineer's last-ditch mania, were already tearing through the bags. The siren draws all power, but it's a field. If we can't record sound, maybe we can still create it. He snatched up his primary digital field recorder, the expensive unit that had earlier displayed the chilling input overflow error. Its main battery was dead, but professional recorders often have tiny, internal backup capacitors meant to save the last 5 seconds of data. Owen knew they couldn't run. The only way out was through the silence, and to do that, they needed to overwhelm the siren's hunting shroud with pure, chaotic noise. His eyes fell on the laptop. It too was near dead, flickering erratically due to the energy drain. But the one thing it still contained was the terrifying, corrupted audio file from the night before. The clip that transitioned from the siren's wail into the personalized lullaby. The laptop has enough juice for one playback, Owen explained frantically, ripping a short auxiliary cable from a spare bag. The recorder's capacitor might power one small speaker. The only thing that broke the spell before was white noise. But this time we need something louder. Something worse. He connected the laptop's nearly dead audio jack to the tiny external speaker powered by the recorder's last dying internal capacitor. The setup was makeshift, desperate, and held together by sheer luck and the failing laws of physics. We hit it with its own weapon, Owen yelled over the groaning of the cabin. We loop the wail, the sound of its agony, and blast it back at maximum volume. It's the only sound it hasn't suppressed yet, because it was her sound. The unblinking watcher struck the door, splintering the frame and sending a shower of wood splinters across the room. A large, dark hand could be seen through the gap, reaching for the latch. "Do it, Owen! Now!" Maya screamed, kneeling protectively over Ethan. Owen hit play. The cabin was instantly, violently, shattered by the noise. The siren's wail, the original high-frequency scream of agony that had terrorized them the first night, erupted from the tiny speaker. Because the sound was being channeled through a corrupted file on dying technology, the audio was distorted, maximized, and looped with a monstrous, deafening feedback. It was pure sonic chaos, an audio loop of its own pain playing back at its face. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The physical presence of the unblinking watcher outside the door recoiled violently. The dark hand retracted, and a soundless shockwave of energy hit the cabin. The walls stopped trembling, and the floorboards settled with an abrupt thud. The siren's acoustic suppression field had broken. Suddenly, the world rushed back in. The wind whipping the mist, the loud, chaotic hiss of the feedback loop, and the agonizing, sharp thump of Ethan's pulse. The three friends looked out the window. The white mist was receding, pulling away from the cabin like a horrified veil. The unblinking watcher was still there, but it was shrinking, its form blurring, melting back into the swirling fog, forced out by the agonizing sound of its own torment. The noise had worked. They had used the siren's own pain, its own unique frequency of suffering, against it, overloading its field of silence and buying them precious seconds. As the feedback loop finally sputtered and died, along with the laptop's final spark of life, the natural, damp sounds of the forest rushed back in, now the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. The siren was gone, banished by the chaotic echo of its own history. The final moral was clear. When facing a supernatural predator that hunts through silence, the only path to safety is often a desperate, ingenious act that weaponizes the entity's own history, using its greatest sorrow as the ultimate, chaotic shield. The silence was broken. They were alive, but stranded with an injured friend and no technology, deep in the heart of the hushed ground. Their desperate journey was far from over, But for the first time since the wail began, they heard a sound that was not their fear, but the promise of escape. Survival is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the reckoning. You can outrun the monster, but you cannot outrun the memory. And in the dark places of the world, when you steal a secret and live to tell the tale, the price of freedom is paid long after the silence is broken. The blast of feedback had shattered the siren's silent shroud, but it hadn't destroyed the spell entirely. The white mist remained, though thinner, smelling faintly of burnt electrical components and ozone. The immediate, suffocating pressure was gone, replaced by the terrifying, natural cold of the deep forest night. Maya used a few remaining strips of medical gauze to stabilize Ethan's badly injured leg, splinting it against a broken chair leg. He was pale, sweating profusely, but conscious. His obsession was finally dead, replaced by a profound, shaking remorse. "The doll?" Ethan whispered hoarsely, staring at the small wooden figure still resting on the floor, its vibrating now reduced to a faint, erratic tremor. "It was never for me. I should have left it." "It's over now, Ethan," Maya said, her voice strained. "We just need to get out." Owen, exhausted but hyper-focused, retrieved the doll. He looked at it, the small, silent ward that had caused so much horror. He carefully placed it inside a deep tear in the lining of the pelican case, sealing it not as evidence, but as a silent, terrible reminder. They spent a harrowing hour making their escape. Owen supported Ethan, dragging him in a painful, clumsy shuffle while Maya took the lead, using her internal compass and knowledge of the terrain to navigate the receding, confusing fog. They found the faint fire road again, and then, mercifully, the main trail leading back to their distant campsite. The journey back was a gauntlet of exhaustion, pain, and gnawing fear that the siren would resume its silent pursuit. But it never did. The woods slowly began to revert to normal. They started to hear the sounds of life again, the chirping of unseen insects, the rustle of leaves in a gentle, real breeze. The siren's field of influence was localized, contained to the cursed hush ground. When they finally staggered into their original campsite near dawn, they found everything exactly as they had left it, peaceful and ordinary, as if their entire ordeal had been a shared, frantic dream. They were rescued 3 days later by a search and rescue team dispatched after their satellite phone failed to check in. Ethan was airlifted out for surgery on his fractured tibia. Maya and Owen, though physically battered, refused medical attention for anything but dehydration. In the weeks that followed, their group splintered entirely. Ethan recovered from his injury, but his career as a documentarian was permanently derailed. He destroyed all the physical tapes and hard drives containing the footage, including the final, corrupted sound file, an act of repentance and survival he never spoke of. The only thing he kept was the pelican case. He now lives in quiet isolation, working a non-creative job, forever haunted by the soft, whispered words, "Little Lark." He learned the hardest lesson of all, that some stories are not yours to tell. Owen never touched a parabolic microphone again. He was unable to work in audio production. The memory of the absolute silence and the terrifying feedback loop had damaged his professional hearing and his mental stability. He took a job repairing simple electronics, where he finds comfort in systems that adhere strictly to the laws of physics, a necessary shield against the chaos he witnessed. Maya was the only one who found a fragile peace. She kept detailed notes of their expedition, not for publication, but for her own understanding. She realized that her respect for the lore had saved them. She dedicated herself to studying remote Appalachian history, becoming a guardian of the knowledge. She understood that the siren was not a monster seeking blood, but an ancient wound in the land, retaliating against the disrespect of the living. She never returned to the area, but she sends a package to the Appalachian National Park Service every year. A simple, hand-carved wooden doll identical to the one Ethan stole, accompanied by an anonymous note asking for it to be placed near the creek bed, an offering to keep the peace. Years later, a new film crew arrived in the Appalachian region, seeking to document the persistent legend of the singing woman. They found the creek bed strangely overgrown, the path almost entirely erased. They found the place where the water stopped, the earth unnaturally dry. But they found no signs of the bone spiral, and their sensitive audio equipment registered only the normal, chaotic sounds of the wild. Their guide, a quiet, knowledgeable local woman who vaguely resembled Maya, advised them sternly to leave the place alone. When the new crew left the area disappointed, convinced the legend was nothing but fiction, the forest settled. Deep in the valley, in the exact center of the ancient, empty creek bed, a tiny, fresh trickle of water began to flow. The land had finally accepted the payment of respect. The silence was over,